The Norwegian Method.
I'm Olav Alexander Boo, peak human performance developer, coach to Kristian and Gustav.
I'm Dr David Lipman, a health and human performance specialist, and welcome to the Norwegian Method podcast.
The Norwegian Method.
Welcome back to the Norwegian Method podcast. Joining me again today, Olav, welcome.
Thank you, David.
I'm really excited about today. We've been, teasing for a long time, talking about different power profiles and changing them and how to change them. We've had quite a bit of back and forth in general, but then certainly today around what this podcast should look like, how to do this, how to deliver value for people. So we're hoping we've got some variety of agreement from the audience when we release this. So what we're going to do today is look at some power profiles from Kristian and Gustav from specifically Tokyo Olympic timeframe, and then the following year's Kona timeframe. So that's about a year apart. And we're going to look at the differences in the tuning there. And one thing to note here is these are cycling only. Now, there is infinite complexity if we start to add swimming as a portion of this and cycling as a portion of this. So that's the first preface here, is we're trying to keep this simple enough that it makes sense as a principle for people, but acknowledging that there is complexity here that we're not going to touch on. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think also you could say that the curve in one sport is anyway a reflection of what's happened in the two other sports as well. So it's not like you're going to continue to run the same way that you are training for the Olympics and then start cycling more like you do for an Ironman. It's basically running and cycling curves for Tokyo, or basically for Olympics, are different, or it has the same similarities as they would be when you're changing it for Ironman. Then you have the same similarities in the change of how you distribute the training for your athletes.
So would we see a change in, or are the changes that we see being mirrored, is that as a result of the training itself, or is that a result of transference of training from one sport to another sport, from cycling to running? Is it purely because we're changing both, or is there some transference that would drive some of this change as well?
You could say a little bit both. The main reason for both, why both running and bike curves are changing, are because you're changing the training mainly or primarily, but also because the demands to change the curves like this too is very different too. You would still see a force adaptation to your running curve. So let's say you kept your running the same way you did leading into Tokyo, then and you kept that going into World Champs in Ironman. And you only changed your cycling. The problem is that alone is already now such a much bigger energy demand that you would probably start to underperform on a program that was more targeted towards what you did leading into Tokyo. So, but but what you really want to do is exactly changing both the training for your being more specific towards your Ironman. So it means basically the curves are a reflection of a change in training, both in cycling and in running.
Yeah, but there is also, but I guess the method or the underpinnings of this are both the result of training and some transference of training there. Probably more transferring of running to cycling, as is always the case, as I understand it. Is that fair to say that changing your running will disproportionately affect your cycling rather than the other way around?
Again, it comes back to one thing that we haven't included here, and that is basically like how you distribute. Let's say that if you look at it on a weekly basis, so let's say there's 30 hours of training. One thing that we don't talk about here or show graphs of here is basically how that changes for both cycling and running. But you can keep up. You can still keep the same kind of program and the intervals and how you distribute it for running, and you can try to maintain that as much as possible. But simply because of the, let's say, increased now energy demand that comes from becoming more specific for Ironman cycling, that will most likely drive you into worst case overtraining state if you continue to do that or you try to force that. But on the other side, most likely you will start to just underperform on a program that is Olympic oriented for the running part of it, more or less here. So I wouldn't say as much as there is a, yes, you could say that there is a somewhat of a transfer between the sports because you are using very much the same muscle groups, but you could, if you're just scaling down the volume, so let's say you scale down the volume to allow for more recovery, you could still uphold pretty much of a mean maximal power curve. So basically the power curves that we see here are basically mean maximal power curves. So you could uphold a mean maximal power curve in the short duration portion of it by scaling down the volume. But again, what we have to remember that in the end, what you're going to do is you're going to perform on an Ironman day, or basically running for X amount of hours, 2-4 hours, after you've been biking for a solid portion. So you're already probably on, let's say the Kristian, or basically the front pack today, they are on the bike. So if you basically take 277 watts, so if your average power for an Ironman and you're cycling around 4 hours and you are biking at 277 watts, that basically is an output of approximately 4,000 kilojoules at the end of it. And what we also have to remember, and when we are looking also at the mean maximum power curves, we are looking at a fresh curve. And that's why it is like 0 kilojoules, because it's not truly 0 kilojoules would mean that this curve basically gets created from not doing anything. So that's impossible. So that's why it is quote unquote 0 kilojoules, just to state that it's a fresh, or basically when there's minimal work done, versus more than 2,000 kilojoules. But the reason why I put 2,000 kilojoules here also is that for athletes that don't ride 277 watts or higher, for example, this would only give you, if you ride 277 watts, this will only get you to 2 hours of work, really. And then you're looking at the curve. What does it look like after 2 hours if you're riding average 2,277 watts first, and then you do. And obviously also, if you have more variations inside your work, that's also going to have an implication on your curve as well. But I think that's already getting too much into the details, really, if we want to explain the concept here. So I think for the simplicity, but still very usefulness here, is rather to look at, you could say, even take away the work, the 2,000 kilojoules, and just look at the curve fresh for both of them. And then you just look at, even there you'll see that there's a significant change in how the curves look like when we target Tokyo versus we target Kona. But it's also interesting to put in the fatigue curve, because they also give a reflection of when you do more work. And again, we have to remember that triathlon is basically swimming, and already in the swim portion of it, you're already expending for an Ironman 1,500 kilojoules of work. And then you get on the bike and you do more than 4,000 kilojoules of work. So now you're already at 5,500 kilojoules. So you can even say that if you wanted to look at your running performance, you would like to look at that beyond 5,000 or 5,500 kilojoules, maybe even 6,000 kilojoules. But to really understand, okay, what is the performance, how are you performing it? Because that's when your running really matters. Your running doesn't matter so much when it's fresh. So that's why also this is one of the very complex parts with triathlon, is piecing this together so that you get the specificity across it. And that's also in this case here, we are focused on the cycling part of it, just to talk more about the concept so people can understand more, like how do you rebalance or pivot your curve for the same hours you have to focus more on Ironman.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's really important for people to hear that, the different constraints that impact this. Let's maybe dig into, just to frame things up, we can go back into some of the details of how later, but let's just talk about the curves briefly. We'll pop them up on screen here for people. So you can see here, we'll start with Kristian's, and we'll go without any of the fatigue stuff. So we just have two curves here, one red, one yellow. As watchers who may understand power duration curves would intuit, the yellow is Tokyo 2021 and the red is Kona 2022. So I guess to state some of the obvious for people, perhaps those who are just listening, you can see that maximum power is higher for Tokyo, and it stays above, for a power duration, that is. So that is 1 second through to, the crossover point is right around 1 minute 45. They start to cross over, which is a little bit earlier than I thought. I thought you might have a crossover point probably further on, maybe 5-10 minutes, but we can talk about maybe why. And then they mirror each other after that a bit better, and stay pretty similar. I mean, maybe a difference there, but right out to, I think you've gone to 3 hours here.
This is a logarithmic curve. They are actually stretched. The x-axis here actually is all the way out to 6 hours.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it goes all the way out to 6 hours. So you can, and I guess the most important point there for people is that it really flattens out, right? This curve flattens out. That's how all of these curves will look like when you use these sort of scales. So let's start maybe at why is a crossover point where it is? Do you have any insight into that? Was that a goal? Was that a training idiosyncrasy?
No. So one thing also that is important to say, that we don't really do all-out testing. So some people like to feed the curve with all-out testing, but with what you can also say is that the curve is still a reflection of your training still too. It is just that you would be able to, let's say, grow the whole curve very simply by just doing some all-out efforts across the range here. So first of all, this is a reflection of the training, what has been done in training. Secondly, if we look at the crossover for Kristian, for example, the reason for why it doesn't have so much or why the crossover is happening, let's say around 1 minute, is because we really didn't do very much work that had shorter durations than 1 minute, and 1 minute is still where you when we do some progressive work, for example, then you could end up having maybe some few efforts that are a little bit harder. That is feeding this part of the curve. But if we looked here at the total volume spended around the different intensities here, the really big portion starts to come around 3 to 5 minutes. That's where, which again is not reflected in the curve here, but that's where the big part of the work shifted. So everything that had a duration that was longer than 3 minutes, so 3, 4, 5 minutes and longer, that part we did much more training on. And the reason for that is also to raise the ceiling as well for the work that comes, next stage below there again. So again, we mentioned this several times before, but your 2 hour power can never be higher than your 1 hour power. Your 1 hour power never higher than your 30-minute power. Your 30-minute power never higher than your 5-minute power, and so on. And that means also here that if the curve gets too flat, that can potentially lead to underperformance, or also where you're not able to grow necessarily the curve any further. There are a couple of implications here into this, simply by that it also, we have to remember that we don't go out and do an Ironman every day. You do different volumes of different sessions. Some sessions are shorter, some sessions are longer. So it's also about, understanding how different workouts with a certain duration has an impact also on the training. I'll give people some small food for thought, and that is that you can even go out and do a repeated sprint effort at around 800 watts, yep, for example. So let's say if you take Kristian's curve here, and I took him out and I gave him a session at around 800 watts, he could get a very high aerobic stimulus, as opposed to basic people thinking of that as anaerobic, by just doing enough repeated intervals with just enough, recovery in there. So let's say that we did 800 watts, but we did 45 of them during an hour. So he would be then starting every 90 second, for example. Then we could get in 10 seconds, and it's around 800 watts, and he would do 45 of them during a session, approximately starting every 90 second. And that would be a very high aerobic stimulus, because you're repeating so many of them. So they will start to drive up your ventilation. They will start to drive up your heart rate, which obviously is an indication of that this is starting also to become more of an aerobic stimulus. The problem with it is that the amount of kilojoules that you're getting around there is, of course, low compared to doing this around LT2 instead. So that's why obviously we are looking to how can we pack in a decent amount of kilojoules for the time constraints that you have around your training. So if you can only do 2 hours, for example, of training, you are looking to make a workout where you can pack in a decent amount of kilojoules for those 2 hours, targeting what you're looking to improve for the athlete.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why you want to have a VO2 master, because when athletes or customers comes there and they are doing the training, they're putting in money and hours into improving the fitness, you want to have a device that basically allows you to track their progress, but also measuring their metabolic power as well. And then on top of that, the only way to truly be able to do individualization is also to measure the utilization of the athletes. And there is probably no better device on the market to do that with than, for example, the VO2 master.
If you've been thinking about adding VO2 testing to your training facility, you know our viewers get an exclusive one-on-one consultation with their product experts on how to make VO2 Master work for you. Head to vo2master.com/Norwegian-method to book yours today, or follow the link in our show notes.
The Norwegian method.
You also, again, to touch back on some previous stuff we talked about, if you're doing those 800 watt intervals, the forces on the periphery, on the musculoskeletal system, are exponentially higher than the equivalent amount of work accrued at a lower intensity. Right? So if we took the same kilojoules and budgeted that out and made it more a consistent effort, maybe it's LT2, maybe it's lower, but the forces on the peripheral system are significantly, or it's exponential, right? As you've made the point before. And that's not good or bad. That is what it is. You may want to use that as a training stimulus. And I know you have done some of this when moving the guys towards more of the Olympic distance stuff, is you would do similar amounts of work, but just at a higher intensity and breaking it up into intervals more than the extended duration stuff, as I understand it. And please correct me if I'm wrong. But I think the important thing is just understanding that these are variables. It's an ingredient, right? We have a recipe for the training session. And it's just which ones of these are we tweaking up and down for different constraints and different end goals.
Yeah, you can say that, of course, with a power meter, this is fairly easy to keep track of, because when you have a power meter, then you're already at so normally when we talk about exponential relationships, let's say in physics, you could say that if you double the velocity, or let's say, for example, if you talk about fluid dynamics, for example, so if you double the velocity of an object traveling through a fluid or gas, and then basically that's gonna increase the force acting on it by second power, and the power that's gonna require is basically the second power of the force again as well. So basically you get an 8 times increase of velocity over power. In the case here, when we're using a power meter, then it's obviously we are working not so much with velocity. While you have the circumferential velocity where which you're pedaling with, but that's your cadence. But here, as long as you keep track of your cadence and your torque and your power, these relationships stays fairly predictable, or you keep track of them. But one thing that to keep in mind also is that very often when we talk about power, we talk about average power, at least average over 1 second. The fact is that there is also intracyclic power, which is like the peak power that you see normally during one revolution is, let's say statistically speaking, maybe 4 times higher than the average power. So that means that if you are outputting 300 watts, normally that would be then 1200 watts peak power in that revolution. For one normally quantified as 1 degree in the revolution. But that means also that shorter duration intervals will normally have more acceleration, because if you do like one, you have basically one acceleration and then it's steady torque, or let's say it's not because you have intracyclic, but let's say for the sake of simplicity, you have steady torque, steady cadence to give that steady power. But when you do more acceleration, so you have shorter intervals, then you also are obviously every time you start a new interval, you have a higher torque there. But again, it's about the proportion. We are only talking about seconds before you are 10 seconds before you're up to the power that you want to have, and then steady from there. So that means that if you really want to work on the torque part of it or acceleration part of it, then you need much shorter intervals or more accelerations in the workup. But that's, again, we are getting off the track here compared to what he said. But again, back to the question about the crossover between the Kona and Tokyo being around 1 minute or 90 seconds here. That has more to do with that we did far less training at intensities above, let's say, or shorter than 90-second intervals, less accelerations, because like Tokyo Olympics, what a lot of people actually forget is that in Olympic racing, you would normally have between 30 to 50 accelerations, or basically power spikes that exceeds 700-800 or even 1,000 watts. Not all of them 1,000, but they would range between, let's say, 800 to 1,000 watts. And you have 30 to 45 of those, or 30 to 50 of those in an Olympic racing. And obviously, having those 800 to 1,000 watt spikes for 30 to 45 times during a race is specific to Olympic racing. In Ironman racing, you don't see this at all. You will have spikes, but they are much lower. And normally it's more surges that is happening there, because you have to overtake, or there's some variations in the course and this kind of thing. But it's not 90 degrees corners or 180 degree corners and bunch riding, almost like more like crit racing. So again, what you basically see here is exactly that. One, the efforts goes down, so you're losing a little bit that capability because you're training less on the high duration efforts, and in this case shorter than 90 seconds. And the other part of it is also that spending less time and spending, or let's say, less targeting the high intensity part. But from 90 seconds out, that is typically something that we would spend more. Like, for example, if we did some VO2 max efforts and so on, we would normally could keep them as short as 60 seconds, depending on, but then typically more towards the end of a session to work on very specific things to keep up quality on a little bit more fatiguing session. So you get a little bit more often rest in that, but to get the mechanical load that is there. But what you get a little bit tricked about here as well is that if you look at the area under the curve, so if you basically took the power and you multiplied it by the duration you're looking at the curve here, then you would see that there is a significant amount of kilojoule difference between. So if you look here at 35 minutes, to put it that way, that's already here well above or 400 watts. But if you look at the yellow one, which is actually from Tokyo, then you would see that this is actually below. And the difference, that looks maybe small, but I can tell you it is big, especially when you're around those intensities for how you are drawing from the glycolytic energy from the glycolytic system as well. But then you can say, but hey, shouldn't the 35-minute power or 1 hour power be higher for the Olympics versus Kona? No, not really, because you're not racing at LT2 power for the duration of what you do in the Olympics. It's very staccato, or very is a high variability in the power output. So actually your power output actually is more similar to your LT1 for the bike part, mechanically, from a mechanical perspective, fresh. But because you're swimming and it's so high intensity, and the rest goes with so high intensity, if you measure the lactate, well, actually lactate wouldn't be useful in this context, but the metabolic load actually here is more closer to basically your LT2, while you're still riding at the LT1, simply because of the effort or the high intensity on the swim, transition, and then the natural variation with all the cornering and riding that happens on the bike in the Olympics. So that means that it's the contrast in racing in Olympics is far greater than it is in Ironman racing, and that's why the more LT2 becomes a more important thing to try to race as much as possible for Kona than it is for the Olympics. And also one other reason for that is that one thing that even for Kristian and Gustav or other Ironman athletes that you have limited time to spend on each training session you do, because you normally do 3 sessions a day. You can't go out and ride 5 hours on your bike every day. because some days you have to prioritize harder swim sessions, some days longer and tough really run sessions as well. So that means also that one way to really also increase your, call it fat max, or increase the utilization, so basically bringing up the intensity or the power output or velocity that you can run at, in order while still having a high utilization of fats. One of the best ways to do that, again, because of the time constraints, so looking at it from a practical perspective, is actually raising the intensity, but actually pushing out the duration of it in those sessions, because that will force the body to use more energy from, or that has to come more from fat oxidation as well. So this means that in this case here, obviously from Ironman, that is super important, because you want to be able to raise with as high power output as possible, while utilizing ideally more fats, because you don't really need a big glycolytic power for Ironman racing. If that makes sense, or if I'm able to explain that in a way that it's easy. Think of it this way: if you improve your 8-minute power here on the curve, it's not like that's going to come like a spike up on 8 minutes and then it drops down again. What it really does is that it flattens even the curve even a little bit more, because this one is a reflection of the total hours of training that you have available. So that means that any lift that comes, let's say at 8 or the longer durations out here, will normally also, as long as you see also the tail coming then up even further, it basically drives higher fat metabolism in the end.
One thing I think that's important that we just tick off for people quickly is understanding how this data was acquired. You talked earlier about feeding the curve, which would be to say, I'm going to go do a maximal 1 second, 10 second, 50 second, so that I know my true maximal ability in training on these different durations. That's certainly one way. And we've talked a bit about getting an idea of durations, right? Doing some testing, short, medium, and longer term durations. That's what our last podcast was about. But how is this data acquired? Just so people understand it. This, I assume, is to do with training data, and it's non-maximal efforts, but an indication.
Yes, we don't have maximal efforts, but you can also say that one thing that we know very well is, as long as you have a sound training program and you are you have workouts that goes, let's say, to use some arbitrary numbers, but let's say 8, 9 of basically exhaustion, then you could still say that, well, the amount of power that you would be able to push a little bit higher up is not that much. It's not like you can go out and you go riding 200 watts every day for a month, and that's the only thing you do, and then you just say, but I'm training 30 hours a week. 30 hours a week, and you just go riding 200 watts, and you do that for a prolonged period, and just say that, well, I should be fit enough to go out and ride now 400 watts for 2 hours, or not for 1 hour. Doesn't happen. You need to practice what you want to be good at, and then yes, if you don't feed it with all-out efforts, but as long as there's sound training program, you can maybe expect to go obviously a little bit harder than what you have fed the curve with, but it limits itself. And that means, again, all out efforts, there are strengths and weaknesses to feeding a curve with that as well, because it comes down to the day, the situation, the climate, and all these kind of things. So you could really go out and maybe it was a better effort one day, but there were other things that was, limiting the data, so you really are. And that's why I more want a curve that is reflective of what we do controlled in training than necessarily trying to manipulate the curve by putting in some all-out efforts.
Yeah, okay, that's super helpful. Thank you. So let's look at Gustav's curve now. I guess looking at that and popping that up on screen, again, we have the Olympics in yellow and we have Kona in red. Crossover point, very similar. I mean, maybe it doesn't quite cross, but very similar duration there. So coarsely maybe similar. But for me, the thing that stood out here is the delta in the short duration in comparison to Kristian, who's, had a much higher ability or much his power ability on short duration was much more, even going into Kona. So what was, I guess, is this a function of Gustav's cycling ability and his aerodynamics and these sort of things, or is there something else at play?
So aerodynamics actually doesn't play into this curve since they are focused on power. But one thing that you actually see here is basically something that is symptomatic between the two, or where the individualization comes in. So Gustav actually needs far less training on the high intensity part, and he can actually even be in a detraining block or something like this, and he can bounce back immediately, basically on VO2 max efforts and shorter durations, and be where he should be. But he's losing his utilization, or basically his LT2 much faster, so that drops much faster off for him. So he needs more maintenance or more training on that to train that, while Kristian is actually the opposite. He can detrain or not do very much training. He maintains pretty much of his LT2 and even his LT2, but he loses his high end. So his VO2 max and his high end part comes down much quicker for him than it does for Gustav. So that's actually what you see here is actually more a reflection of the individualization, that Gustav needs more training around LT2 to maintain it or to build it, while Kristian needs less in order to maintain it or train it.
Yeah, gotcha. Sorry, I was talking about reflection of different power requirements on the bike for the same speeds.
Okay.
And the aerodynamics.
Yes.
Because obviously Gustav spent a lot more time as a sort of junior cyclist, as I understood it. So I thought maybe that would be the reflection, is to achieve similar speeds, he would need less power.
Yes, he can normally ride 10%, 5-10%, 10% less power than what Kristian does for the same. But that has to do both a little bit with weight. So if you want to normalize it on the climbs for watts per kilogram, but also in terms of aerodynamics, simply because he has a more he is able. He has a little bit more flexibility, so he has a flatter back, can stay flatter on his upper part, but also the legs obviously contribute a big part to the aerodynamics. And Kristian he has a big chest to push through water when he's swimming, and he has some big legs to that are seeing a lot of air when he's cycling. So he needs to put out a little bit more power there too. Yeah.
He did mention a goal of his was to have his calves touching when he was standing still recently. So that makes some sense. No, that's really interesting. So I guess these are two, let's call them moments in time, and they're about a year apart, as we've already alluded to. So that's what it takes in a year, basically, to get from here to here, is the simple answer. But maybe one thing to think about is, does this happen quickly, slowly? Is it a sort of 80-20 principle, or is it gradual that we see this changing slowly over time?
No. So this is something that when we were done with the World Championship in Edmonton, so the short course, this was an instant, let's say almost like an instant change in the training. So if you were looking at, if you basically lock this period into, so if we then look at Cozumel, or if you take Cozumel then as an example, then you could say that if you looked at Kristian's curve for the same period, but including Edmonton, then it would be pretty much the same curve. But if you looked at it the day after Edmonton, leading into Kona, because Cozumel, because I think between Edmonton and Cozumel, we had 2 months, September, October. Yeah, I think 2 months approximately we had there. Then you will see that over those 2 months, we really had to change the training radically to get in, let's say, the work that we wanted to get in, specializing him for Cozumel, where he set the record.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why I use Maurten with the boys is because it reduces the GI stress. And the reason why it reduces the GI stress is basically because carbohydrates are packed in a hydrogel. And why that is important again is because if you can then take more carbohydrates per time, it means basically also you can train faster or race faster, which ultimately is the goal in our sport.
To benefit from the one-time code and get 20% off your next purchase on Maurten.com, simply enter the code TNMS1 at checkout. The code is applicable once per customer on all products except the Maurten bicarb system, valid until the 31st of December 2025.
The Norwegian method.
And again, these are a reflection of what's done in training, not absolute maximal capacities. So in some respects, because you didn't do the short duration, the curve changes quickly because it just wasn't there to record it. Whereas if you tested all our capacities at those short durations, there was probably some maintenance there just by virtue of that's how the body works. It's not going to just decay straight away. Even in him, who you've alluded to, loses a bit of VO2 max a bit quicker.
Yes, exactly. Kristian loses his high end part 2 to 4 weeks. It's already quite a bit down. Gustav, very, very little. And again, opposite for the LT2, Kristian maintains large part of that, while Gustav loses that part much quicker than what Kristian does.
And is that mirrored in their retraining effect? Is it easy come, easy go, or is it easy go, very difficult to come?
No, it comes simply because of the amount of hours they put in over the years. It's something that you normally are able to build back within most of that. I would say that if you really wanted to go in and just build it back as quickly as possible, then we could probably build it back within 2 to 4 weeks, let's say 4 weeks, to be on the safe side. But again, that would make sense because here it's about building a plan for a longer period where you rather want to build an even better fundament for what comes next in the training, depending on demand of the race that you think is going to be there or you set as a target.
Yeah, no, that's a much smarter way of doing things. It's interesting you say that because we released, at the time of recording this, we've just released our episode with Gustav after his Oceanside efforts. And he was actually saying he had really good top end numbers, which was quite surprising to him. So it mirrors what you're saying. So
yeah.
it's always nice when everyone agrees. Shall we talk a little bit about fatigue versus fresh curves then? And looking at these and the changes in them. Again, there's lots of nuance here around what do we, I don't want to say care about, but what are we taking notice of? And that is, are we looking at fresh versus fatigued? How much fatigue? And we generally quantify that, especially in cycling, in kilojoules, which is just work done, versus, because that will change things. So really this is about what people would call durability or fatigue resistance or whatever term you want to use, which is what percentage of your fresh can you perform under fatigue? Is really how we're thinking about this. How do we maintain our physiology and our abilities here? So looking at Kristian's here, and as you said, you use 2,000 kilojoules. Again, just to highlight to people, because it can be a little bit confusing with different colors. Again, we're talking about Tokyo in yellow, and then the dotted pink line is his fatigued. And then Kona is the solid red and the dotted purple line with his fatigue there. So looking at that, the things that jump out to me are that the fatigue seems to affect him more for Tokyo, which again would make sense. You're trying to build a fatigue-resistant athlete for Kona. And that particularly manifests, so it doesn't really manifest more in any one spot. But when we're looking at Kona, it manifests much more in short duration. His fatigue affects those short durations much more compared to a longer duration, even if we start to consider that there's scaling, as you said before, the work between 35 minutes, or if there's a difference of a couple of over 100 watts or 5 watts or 10 watts, it's multiplied by 35 minutes. So obviously it's bigger than we can see it on the scale, but that's an interesting observation there. Did you have any thoughts around this? Was this a plan? Was this interesting? I don't really have a question for you. I'm just trying to gain your insights around it.
Yeah. So also one thing, just here, what we have to remember is that 35 minutes. So when we talk about greater than 2,000 kilojoules, that's 2,000 kilojoules or more than 2,000 kilojoules plus then a 35-minute effort here in this case here. So that's important to keep in mind. But I think the first takeaway here I would focus on is that. If you look obviously here at the fresh versus fatigued curve here. So in this case here, Tokyo, if you look at that yellow one or the orange one, solid one, then basically, again, this is what we looked on the previous one. It's higher, or it's the highest basically in the short duration efforts, let's say shorter than 90 seconds. The red curve is basically Kona, as we saw on the previous one. But more interestingly here to look at is maybe the blue one, because the blue one here is more like you can then say, okay, what does this really show me here? First of all, if we did some effort or something like with a higher intensity and so on, it would typically come at the beginning of a session or something like that. That means that there are really not any training on the short duration efforts, for example, happening after 2000 kilojoules in our training. So again, this is not really reflective of necessarily what he could have done if he wanted to do it. It's more a reflection of the training, and that's what I think is the important thing to focus on here. Like, how should I, because people are not like saying that this is how you should perform in Kona. That's one thing, but that's not really what you're after. You are actually looking at how can I train the best possible? What should I change in my training here to be the best for Kona? Racing is again just a reflection of your training or what you're putting down in your training. So if we look then rather for a little bit more the specific part of it, which is typically like LT2 intervals that would have a duration of somewhere between 4 to 8 minutes or like 4 to even 12 minutes. But let's say most of our LT2 intervals was probably around 6 to 10 minutes long. That's where most of them, but as short as basically down to 4 minutes. And as long as the longest, probably 12 or 15 minutes, but very, very few of those. I would say very few intervals lasting longer than 10 minutes for the LT2 part. But if we then look at basically intervals here, or basically look at the duration that is here, you see that basically between Kristian's Kona curve, fresh versus fatigued in that domain, is virtually the same between 90 seconds and beyond. And that is exactly to show, to train, let's say, because here is where we could accumulate 80 minutes, 90 minutes of work around that intensity that is there, around those let's say around those duration or efforts. And that means again here that what you see is that he has now an excellent durability or fatigue resistance or anything, what you would call it in that domain that is there.
Yeah.
Beyond this, then you get a little bit tricked by the curve here. And that is that if we really looked at all out efforts here, you would actually see that probably if we... LT1, again, we don't really do LT1 intervals lasting very much longer than 20, some of them up to 30 minutes long, but that's very, very few. Most of the LT1 intervals, again, for us, is more like 20, 15 minutes long, 20 minutes long. That's how long they are, but with very, very short breaks in between there. And that's where you also see that basically, if we then looked at, okay, an LT1 interval or LT1 intensity, LT1 power, for example, or LT2 power here, the difference between those two are very, very little, very, very small. If you were to calculate the percentage difference between LT1 and LT2 here, for example, you would also see that that's also very small difference, or the delta between them are very small. What we have to remember, this is a confusion, and that is that you won't raise your Ironman on LT1 power. You're actually going to raise your Ironman on a below LT1 power as it is in training if you use a lactate or a metabolic tool to quantify it. And that has simply to do with the energetic demand, or the demand that comes from your body. So it's not like, even if you're riding your fat max, it's not like you're not using more carbohydrates. For every increase in intensity, you're using more fats and more carbs. It is just that the fat part is just scaling quicker, let's say on the lower intensities, before you come at that point where oxygen starts to become a little bit more of a limiting factor, and other things becomes a little bit more limiting factor, and suddenly increase in glycolysis starts to go up exponentially, moving from there. So again, the important part here is that since we know that this cannot be an all-out effort, Kristian have to be able to go off the bike and run an excellent marathon afterwards. It means basically here we're looking for something that is so robust and so flat in reality that he's using as little as possible energy from the glycolysis, as much as possibly, relatively speaking, from fats, so that when he comes out on the run, he can still also then maintain that higher velocity, not obviously fat max, but ever so slightly above there, because he has as big as possible, let's say, reserves left in the glycogen stores, combined with obviously feeding a lot of carbohydrates, high intake of carbohydrates as well, to try to maintain as much as possible of that for the last 2.5 hours of the race. From basically 5 to 7.5 hours in the race day. So here again, if we then compare Kona and we compare Tokyo here, there we basically see also there's a massive difference. We see that on Tokyo, really fresh, fatigued. That's it's not unusual here simply because we had more of those spiky efforts in the training, and it could be sometimes a little bit. They still did 3 to 4 hour rides, and you could have some of those very short efforts there. So again, not really reflective of that. Then I had to tweak the curve to just say that I want more now. Instead of having like a couple of mean maximal efforts at the short duration, I would say that I would the average of 10 ones of the 10, and that would pull down the curve significantly in that part of it. But what you see here also is that if you then focus again on Tokyo here, so the solid orange line versus the pink dotted line here, you see that there's a significant drop off all over the place simply because we didn't do very much training with the same kind level of fatigue in the body.
Having said that, there is a little bit and this very short duration stuff, which I assume is some fatigue and then some spikes, because that's what's going to be needed in the race, right? That's the specificity of the race, as you said, is some spiky power efforts after some fatigue, because 30 kilometers into the bike, if there's a 180 degree turn, you still have to be able to put out, 800 watts, etc. So I do think that there's some of that in here.
The only thing that is there that we have to remember is that this one is basically only now looking at data beyond 2000 kilojoules. So in order that it's equally much a reflection of the training here, that there was almost no rides, or there were very, very few rides beyond 2000 kilojoules where we started to do like shorter than 90 seconds efforts, for example, because you can say that when you are jumping off your bike in the Olympics, that would basically be at a point where you have done around 2000 kilojoules. That's when you jump off the bike in the Olympics. And the reason for that is because you will have around, let's say, 500 kilojoules on the swim, 500, 600, 700 kilojoules on the swim. And then there is the bike part, which is, I would say, probably closer to 1200. I would have to go back and check, but let's say around 1200 kilojoules on the bike there, which again accumulates to around 2000 kilojoules, a little bit less even.
Let's move on to Gustav's power durations with the fatigue, I guess, added in there. So again, we have same colors as before with Gustav and with Kristian. So we have Tokyo being yellow solid line, Tokyo under fatigue being the pink dotted line, or indeed orange line, if you want to call the first one orange, not yellow. Then we have our Kona lines, which are our solid red and our dotted purple. So these are a lot more clustered, I guess, outside of the fresh Tokyo line. They're a lot more similar than Kristian's were. I might leave you to go on this because you've been on a roll here and giving us some really good insights, and I want to just let you go for it rather than me trying to intuit things.
Yeah, so again, this is of course the difference between Kristian and Gustav as well. So we already talked about the fresh curves for Tokyo versus Kona. But again, this is also a place where Gustav, he needs more work around LT2. He responds really well to it. LT1, LT2, but let's say LT2, or you could say race pace versus LT2 because they have different purposes. We can come back to that another time as well. But there are specific reasons for targeting LT1, and it's not necessarily because it's your race pace, but it has more about practicality and tools available to ensure, let's say, consistency in your training over time. But if we focus on LT2, which is obviously something we do target and we go closer to exhaustion on in the training, especially when we want to increase the fat oxidation, then or let's say fat utilization for a given power output, then one of the things that you see here is that Gustav just maintains really good capabilities on his sprinting part again. Like he doesn't really lose very much on that part of it. And that's why that for the short durations here, they look very much the same, whether he practice it or don't practice it. Again, if I had here put in more like the average of tens over the same period, you would just see that it comes down because simply you haven't done probably 10 efforts that was around it. So you get a little bit of, let's say, a skewed picture of it, simply because this is really what people normally look at. They look at it like a single. What people have access to in, say, for example, Strava, or in Training Peaks, or in intervals. The data that you got available there is normally the reflection of one single mean maximal power effort, and that's why we kept the curve a little bit so people can compare their own curves with the curves that they see here. And again, here, this is more symptomatic for Gustav. He really doesn't lose very much at all by not practicing it at all. But again, he loses more in the longer duration part of it. And that's why it's important, of course, to focus a lot on it. But again, here we see that also him is on the LT2 part. He is already exceeding his Tokyo curve, which you would normally say there's an higher average power output for Tokyo and higher speeds and all this kind of thing. But again, for other reasons, again here, focusing on the utilization or increasing the fat oxidation and making sessions that are really well targeting that, his basically durations around where we have the duration of our LT2 intervals are exceeding what he had leading into Tokyo, because this is getting so important for us to improve in their training that we need to push it up for them. The danger, just to keep that, the danger, of course, pushing it too far is that you lose too much on the glycolysis, so you lose even your 5-minute capabilities, and I think that even starts to come down simply because you're training too much around your LT2, to put it that way. So again, there needs to be a healthy balance, but yeah, it's but one thing you see here also for him is that his again, because it is so important for him to maintain more the longer duration stuff for him, and that's where the focus is. This is also where you see that the delta between his fresh and fatigued, or let's say I wouldn't call it really fatigued, but fresh and beyond 2,000 kilojoules is more correctly to say, is also far less than it is for Kristian again. So it comes back to the individualization and the importance of more for Gustav to prioritize and keep that part up to perform well in races, which he really did in Kona.
Yeah, you could say so. Like, this is the winning curve, so to speak. So listen, I think that's a really good way to end. I think some things we talked about before recording as goals for this was that people started to gain an appreciation for A, what these might look like, but also B, how malleable they are, how quickly they can change and how changeable they are, and the importance of that in the context of planning a season. We've done multiple episodes on how do we build a season, how do we plan a season, all that. And I think the trap that some people get into, particularly people who do events like Ironman or marathon running or anything that's multiple hours, is that they tend to be more of a diesel phenotype and tend to enjoy that long stuff. And I think one of the things I would love them to take away is that there is an importance on the shorter duration stuff and doing that at certain times of the year to facilitate a better curve later in the year. I think that's a really important concept for them to take away from this, is that the short duration will empower the longer duration at a different time.
Yeah, and I think also one way that we could look at that is as well that we could, for example, make one curve for each month and then basically see actually also how the curve is actually changing from month to month to month between, for example, 2 races or 2 periods, just to see how this is. But again, it's a reflection of the training. And that, again, is the most important thing. That is what lays the fundament for your ability to race.
Yeah, that's we're going to end on that. That is too good to say anything after. So I really appreciate your time, Olav. As always, it's been a pleasure for me. Hoping you enjoyed it and hoping the listeners enjoyed it. And if you did, please do share this with somebody. Of course, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please go ahead and do that. Rating the podcast helps us greatly as well. So please do that if you have not done so. But Olav, finally, thank you again. And we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
The Norwegian method.